while Alex is snapping in. I'll introduce Alex, who probably doesn't need too much introduction. He's a remarkably prolific person. CPython, PyPy, Unladen Swallow, Django. He's been a core developer or committer on many interesting projects. He's also the creator of a Ruby VM I discovered while trying to figure out what interesting things I could say about him. But we're going to let him talk to us tonight anyways. So, the death of model view in web applications.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alex. This talk's called the End of MVC, the End of Model View Controller. So first, please feel free to interrupt me as we go. I'll try to specifically pause at various points or questions in the middle, rather than having you save them all to the end. So, kind of brief bit about me. I work at Rackspace. Yes, JJ?
Alex, what makes you so damn awesome?
Rumors of my awesomeness are greatly exaggerated.
His opinions on 2.8.
So I work at Rackspace. I'm a director of the Python Software Foundation, and the 2-second pitch on the Python Software Foundation is we maintain the intellectual property for Python. We run PyCon, and we try to fund awesome stuff within the community. So if you want to host a sprint to work on your favorite project, get new contributors involved, anything like that, we can help fund it. So get in touch if you're interested or have cool work that you think we should fund. And I write a lot of computer programs, which is what brings me here. In particular, for a long, long time, I wrote lots and lots of web applications, mostly with Django, but some with other Python web frameworks, and some with other language frameworks, if you can believe it, Rails and such. So who here writes programs? Like, hands up if you write a program. This is everybody, right? Cool. Who here writes network applications? Some hands. Who here writes web applications? Different set of hands. Who here writes web applications with an MVC framework? Still hands. So something made no sense. There were folks who had their hands up to say they wrote web applications, but they did not have their hands up to say they wrote network applications. And it was thinking about this sort of phenomenon a while ago that kind of was the birth of this talk, which is that for some reason, when we're writing web applications, we seem to not think in the same terms when we're writing other programs. And you saw that, right? Folks did not self-identify as network application programmers, even though that's totally what you're writing, right? You're writing a web application, there's totally a network server, it's listening on port 80, all that good stuff. Like, it's a network application in everything except your mind, for some reason. So I wanted to explore that and look at what the consequences are and other things like that. So the last decade has been dominated by model view framework, web frameworks, except the part where that's not really true, because MVC was originally a term in like the 70s, specifically about GUIs. And GUIs have a bunch of like differences with how we write web applications that are like fundamental. I mean, the term doesn't actually make sense, which means none of us can actually agree on what the term means. But for the purpose of this, MVC frameworks are all those frameworks people call MVC frameworks. Django, Rails, stuff in that family. Stuff that, you know, when we come from, in my case, PHP, we say, oh my God, these frameworks are so great. They force me to have this separation of concerns. I have to care about all this stuff. I love MVC. It's great. But I think it's misleading to blame the stuff I'm going to blame on MVC for a bunch of reasons. So I'm going to blame it on full stack frameworks again. Here it's a slightly different group. Here we're really looking at stuff like Django and Rails, which comes with database libraries and a template language and other stuff. And less so, although not entirely less so, with frameworks like Flask or Pyramid, which include less of the components and make you choose the components you'd like, for better and for worse. So what's in a framework? I want to use a Django, and I'm going to use the word Django a bunch. Feel free to substitute your MVC framework of choice wherever I say Django, but I've been using Django for many, many years at this point, so it's just habit. So what comes with Django? Django comes with a request-response abstraction over WSGI. Nobody likes dictionaries with random file-like things and parsing post bodies themselves, so we give you request objects, response objects. Django is a command line interface for interacting with it, manage.py and Django admin.py, which both let you run various utilities that Django includes, as well as running your own utilities. And then Django is kind of this whole pile of libraries that are useful for websites. The ORM, templates, sessions, internationalization, localization, sessions, caching, a US state field with all the US states, fun stuff like that. But moreover, from what I've seen, Django provides an environment. Any given project uses maybe half of those utilities, and some of those utilities are used more regularly than others. But above and beyond all that, Django provides an environment that you program in. And if you programmed in Django a while and migrated across a lot of Django projects, you've probably seen some common patterns. Rails likes to call this convention over configuration, but I call it the environment we program in. And sort of what encapsulates this idea of the environment we program in for me is there's top questions I see is one I see a lot. How do I do X in Django? How do I write the SQL query in Django? How do I interact with my form this way in Django? And the bottom question is the question I wish people would ask more. Does Django have something that makes it easier to make my form? And the reason I care about this is because the answer to the first question is inevitably, well, you do this the same way in Django that you do everywhere else. Django is not special, it's just a Python program. You would like to execute a SQL query? Okay, import psychopg2, import MySQLDB, and run your SQL query. There's no magic, right? Django does not prevent you from doing any of those things. Django's utilities that make it easier. But I see the first question a lot, and I think it reflects, I don't want to say a fundamental misunderstanding, but a chance for us to do better with educating users about how to use libraries and tools like Django more effectively. But MVC frameworks are getting less popular nowadays I've heard a lot of reasons. I've got a hypothesis about why people are starting to prefer more lighter weight frameworks like Flask, or even languages that provide even less scaffolding for your application, Node.js or Go. My hypothesis is, for like 15 years, HTTP dictated what the user experience of your website could be like. This is kind of not unusual. SMTP or an IMAP and POP3, they dictate what your email client is more or less like. And as a result, most email clients are approximately the same. They have the same models for interaction. HTTP was the same way. HTTP and HTML were, for a long time, extraordinarily limiting in what you could do. Right? They dictated that you were going to make a request, you were going to get some static body back, and then you would click like links or buttons, and those are the only two things you got to click on, and the page would change then. And then we added JavaScript as a practical matter for changing the content a little bit more dynamically, but it was nearly a decade later until you could make requests to the server without reloading the entire page. And that completely brought on a new UX paradigm for interacting with the browser. The continuation of that, the fact that now we have bidirectional communication with WebSockets, we can play videos without loading like intrusive Flash players, all the new stuff that has been brought to us with improvements to HTML with HTML5 and the new CSS specs, some of the cool stuff that's going to come in HTTP2 or with Speedy. All of this stuff is kind of changing what we can do in that we have more control over what the user experience of our websites is with these new technologies. So it's all starting to change. In particularly, it's notable that now we can do so much more on the client side that we now have, in some cases, we're using MVC frameworks on both the client side and the server side, which seems comedically redundant, but like a real reality. And until we move basically everything to the client side, it's a comedic reality we'll live with. But so the dominance of the client side does mean that there's just fewer expectations from the server and different expectations. We expect our clients to be smarter. 10 years ago, your client was an HTTP client in name only, right? It was a browser, and like requests happened when a person clicked on a link. Now, the expectation for a lot of websites is the thing on the other end is a client, which is a series of XML HTTP requests to endpoints that are like rapidly interacting with users. There is not a full reload cycle. Or maybe the consumer of our application is someone with requests or a Python SDK that's going to be that can store a lot more state fundamentally in their application and try to do smarter stuff there. So the expectations of users of websites are changing, where user means either a person or maybe a program. We've got a lot more programs using our websites. So I've got two principles of programming which will inform everything I say for the rest of this. Writing correct code is hard, really, really hard. I don't actually, truthfully, I have no idea what my methodology for writing correct code is. The only thing I found that works is writing tests. So for me, writing tests is like the most important thing I do, and therefore designing code to make them easy to test is like the primary driving factor in almost every piece of code I write today. The second observation I have is that reasoning about code is really, really hard. And so as a result, I try to have to read and think about as little code as possible. When I'm, trying to solve a problem, I want to have to look at as little code as possible. So I want code that is as maximally factored and separated and just well organized as possible, so I can read, one function instead of one file or 10 files, which is what happens when I work with disorganized code. So before I go any further, first round of questions. Anyone? All right, we'll keep going. Oh, somebody?
Can you expand a little bit? You using the term reasoning, and it seems weird in that sentence. What do you mean by that?
So I've got a function here, and it says it performs some operation. I need to go in. Somebody tells me there's a bug. I need to figure out what this function is doing, maybe how it interacts with the rest of my system. I need to understand how that works and reason about its behavior to make sure it basically behaves the way it says on the tin. A lot of this for me comes down to there's sort of an explicit written down what the input and output parameters are. So the input is the arguments your function takes. The output is what it returns. For me, reasoning about code comes down to how closely can I tie its behaviors to those sets of things, and how much of it is affecting other parts of the system that was not written down. So that's what I mean about reasoning about code. All right, keep going. So all of that has led me to be very disappointed with what MVC looks like in practice. Because the promise of MVC, and the thing I most appreciated 7 or 8 years ago when I found it, was this claim that it let me separate my concerns. And truly, it was a step up. What I was coming from before was a land of spaghetti code in the truest sense of the term. My early PHP code was just untold abominations. And the structures that Django gave me did allow for some improvements. But in the 5 years since I was a new Django programmer, I've come to be less and less happy, and I want to see us do more with improving the code we write. So what does MVC look like in practice? This is, this is what an MVC function, this is a view function in Django, and I know it's a realistic view function because it's in the Django tutorial, so we clearly think this is a good idea and think this is how people should learn to write code. So notable things. You got the name of the function, takes a request, takes a poll ID. The Django tutorial example, for those who haven't done it, is a small little application where you create polls with choices and people vote on them. So we get the choice, we display a template saying there's an error if you didn't select a vote. Otherwise, we increment the vote count, we save it, and we show the results. So pretty simple view function, not a ton going on. There's a couple things I think are important to draw our attention to. First, we're reading something out of the request. Not all the data is just not everything comes in the URL like the poll ID. Some things come in the post body, so we get that out. That's normal web application stuff. We're talking to a database. We use the Django helper get objector 404, which very explicitly mixes responsibilities in Django, being part of that bridge between what is the models and what is the HTTP. Django as a framework keeps those pretty separate, but this utility helps with a common use case. If the object you're trying to access doesn't exist, throw a 404. Here we don't use that helper. Here we just catch the does not exist exception ourselves and show a template. So pretty straightforward model stuff going on here. We got we're mutating over there, updating our votes and saving it. Cool. Then we got the redirects and the template rendering. It's good stuff. Classic Django view. In like years of using Django, like 99.9% of views had some stuff in common with this. Fortunately, there's some stuff I'm unhappy with. I want to know why it's doing so much stuff. And I truly think it's doing too many different unrelated things. So it's touching the database. It's touching the request. It's altering the object you got back. And it's responding with a template or a redirect of some sort. And this is too much stuff for me. And what I mean by that is, when I think about sitting down to write something that deals with network protocols, one of the first things I do when designing a program is I split out the parts that deal with the network protocol, and I split out the parts that deal with the business logic. Here our network protocol is HTTP, and while Django has parsed the bytes and given us a nice object representation, we still deal with the HTTP layer at this point. Were I writing if we had the raw bytes here, everyone would think it was ridiculous to parse that post body in the same function that deals with all this business logic. But it's pretty commonplace for Django view functions. So we're dealing with a little too much stuff for my taste. When I think about what it means for a piece of code to be or for there to be separation of concerns, really a fundamental thing to me is that the protocol we use is separated from the logic we implement. It's not true of this function. And so that's one critique I have. So if I had to describe a rule, yes, Simeon?
So am I correct in thinking it doesn't make you happy if you say the answer is use forms and forms talk to the database instead and you have less concerns in your view?
So Simeon's question was, what if you use Django forms? Does this make me or unhappy? Yeah. The answer is both. I like forms as a unit and a way of organizing stuff. I think they're very explicitly in the same way that getObject or 404 is about bridging the gap. They're about bridging the gap. I'm less happy with the way we use forms in practice, which is that forms do not just encapsulate that interaction. They tend to sort of sprawl, right? First, your form is responsible for just displaying the form and validation and dealing with taking a request and turning it into stuff you validate. And then it sprawls a little more. Suddenly your form is sending emails because that's what the form is about. It's a contact form, so when you save, it sends an email. Forms, there's nothing wrong with them conceptually, but they tend to be a site for sprawl in the same way. Forms is sort of a control flow abstraction where they're responsible for doing sort of this routing. They call one function that does the parsing, reads the right values. They call another thing that does validation. And then they call a third thing that's like the save action. That's okay, but what I tend to see is there's this sprawl where you have access to everything at all times. Sort of when I was talking about reasoning, I want to deny access to different pieces of information at different parts of my code. When I'm in the guts of monetizing my polling business, I don't want to have access to requests there. It's out of scope for thinking about that. And giving me access is just potential for me to write code that's hard to reason about later. Similarly, when I'm at the parameter validation stage, making sure the poll ID I was provided is really an integer, stuff like that, I don't want to have access to the database. I don't want to be able to potentially be mutating and saving the fields on the object if I shouldn't have permission at the validation stage. I want to limit my access and limit my ability to screw myself, basically. Because more access to data I don't need is just potential to do something wrong, and it means more inputs to my function, particularly inputs that I don't write down. And I want to constrain the number of inputs. So yes, this is a long-winded answer, yes?
Actually, you've already partially answered this because I had a very similar question to Simeon's, but instead of about forms, I'm asking about class-based views.
Cool, so class-based views. Django 1. Yeah, so yes. About class-based views, which Django introduced in 1.4 something. I have very mixed feelings about class-based views. So I love the concept of class-based views, organizing your stuff. Modules are not the only unit for code organization. Let's put them in a class and organize that way. All on board with that. The class-based generic views, though, I'm a bit less confident about. The inheritance hierarchy you can get out of them is truly like just complex in every sense of the word. So they mostly make me unhappy in a different way. I think you could write a simpler set of like base classes or a simpler set of control flow abstractions that manage this stuff better. I would love to see someone experiment with like an alternate set of class-based views. My feeling has always been I never use the built-in class-based generic views, but many of my projects have my own base class. You know, here is how we do REST APIs in this code base, and here's the base class that implements all the logic for dealing with those. And, you know, it encapsulates all that. So 50-50.
On that note,
does this work? Yes. On that note, do you have any experience with, I believe, TCP or Django REST framework?
It's been several years since I've used them. I would not be comfortable commenting about them. Sorry.
They do exactly what you just asked for.
Cool. That's great. That's fantastic. All right, plowing along. So I'm unhappy. The next thing that makes me deeply, deeply unhappy, possibly more unhappy than anything else on these slides, is that we're touching the ORM all over the place. And what I mean by that is, you know, the Django ORM gives us an API for interacting with our models, which will execute SQL queries on our behalf. And we just use that API all over the place to access the models. If I'd written the SQL there for getObject or 404, you know, select poll.id from where, whatever. If I'd written all that, I would be deeply uncomfortable. I would like, I'm going to put my SQL in the function, right? This is some business logic. It's reusable. I want this to be abstracted. I want this in one place. But here, I just tend to use the Django ORM all over the place. On the one hand, there's less stuff to audit about using the Django ORM. I never have to worry about SQL injection. The API is super readable. Like, getObject or 404 is about as short as you can be, and like it says exactly what it does. There's nothing confusing about it. But at the same time, I'm made deeply uncomfortable by just what a sprawl it is to touch the models everywhere. And I'm concerned about that because I hear questions like, how do I get the current user in the save method? I hear it less now, but for a while, this was like every day I answered this question on the Django users mailing list. And the answer is, why would your persistence layer know about an HTTP request? Much less whatever the current HTTP request means. That piece of code, as like a matter of separation, should not be aware the other code exists and shouldn't care about how it's used. So what's the alternative? Like I said, I think this is a great step up from at least the code I was writing before I found these frameworks. But what is a pattern we can take advantage of to more reliably write better code? And so the thing that I think is most important is projects should be developing their own abstractions. There's a real tendency in projects that use Django, and by a real tendency, I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a project this wasn't true of, which is there's a desire to shove everything into the abstractions Django gives us. Django gives us forms, Django gives us template tags, Django gives us models, Django gives us managers. Everything must be one of these. And if it doesn't fit into that question, if it doesn't fit into one of those patterns, you get a lot of questions. Where does this code belong? Well, the answer is you're writing a software project. It goes in the same place it would if you were writing a command line client or an IRC bot, right? You develop your own abstractions that represent your business logic and that represent use cases. I want to be able to think about my polling logic, and I want to be able to write, this user voted on this poll without needing to know about persistence. When we talk about abstraction, too much we stop at the level of, oh, I don't need to know about Windows or POSIX, or I don't know about MySQL versus Postgres. I don't want to know about what my database is at the time I'm writing persistence logic. A friend of mine, he worked on calendaring, and if you ever want to see a complex business use case, enterprise calendaring is like the scariest thing I've ever seen. But he developed this concrete set of abstractions that let you say things like, I would like to schedule an event with these people at this time without knowing all the details. And dear God, there are details, because scheduling an event actually means sending emails, because that's what a calendar invite is. That's an email. It means updating records in their database. there was a concrete abstraction that represented, that let people talk about things in terms of business use cases. I hate the word domain. It let them talk about domain models and domain activities without knowing about the details under it, and let them implement the domain activities, the persistence logic, all of that, without knowing about where it was being called from. What's going to happen when you replace the HTML templates with now your company ships a JSON API, because HTML is not how you make money in this cruel world. You're going to have to rewrite your entire application, because this is like, man, there's so much HTML and like HTTP going on in here, but I don't want to have to rewrite like my choice poll voting logic. Like that should stick around, right? That's independent of what the UI the person accessing it is. What if I decided that my business is actually IRC polling? I don't want to have to rewrite this. What if I want to write command line utilities for doing administrative work, and I want to be able to make a vote from the command line for the purposes of like debugging stuff in production? I want to be able to do all that without making HTTP requests. So I want to develop more abstractions and more domain-specific abstractions. There should be a concrete abstraction over what it means to interact with a poll, what it means to vote, and it shouldn't be strewn all over the code base. Some in this view function, some in that view function. On the flip side, there are some disadvantages to this. It impacts development speed. If you stop to think about all this stuff and don't say, okay, I'm just going to, that goes in the model, I use my models everywhere, I don't want to develop this, I want to develop as quickly as possible. Yes, I think there is a hit in initial development speed, absolutely. I think there's a win later on in how quickly you can develop once you get past the initial development and get to maintenance. But it's a balancing act. And I can totally see the appeal of not developing that abstraction. That was the first thing, particularly before you know what you want your abstractions to look like and what your domain even is. So there's a balance. On the other hand, I've worked with many Django code bases that are 5+ years old and knew what they were doing and still didn't have these abstractions. So it's not an excuse forever. The other thing it impacts is consistency. One of the best things about Django is I load up a Django project. I know where to start looking for stuff. I go to the urls.py to see what stuff gets hit. Then I go look at the views. Then I look at the models. And I know exactly where all these things are. Developing project and domain-specific abstractions means there's not an obvious place. The polling logic for this application does not look like the logic for keeping track of artists and their albums at another company I worked at, nor does it look like the domain-specific abstractions for golf social networks, another project I worked on. That means as a new person, onboarding these code bases is going to be a slightly different experience. I hope my idea is that it is overall a better experience because you look in one place to see, okay, what does it mean for an artist to release a new album, instead of, okay, here is how the new releases page is computed, here is how the daemon that notices that there are new releases runs, right? One central abstraction means there's one place to look for what it means for something to be a new release and what the business logic is around that. It does mean that when I look at the view, there's not a whole lot there. So that's a big trade-off. So what I hope I've convinced you of is that this pattern of everything goes in the view, which is all too common, and not just in MVC frameworks, right? I look at Flask projects. The same patterns are common. They're just not using an ORM that came with their framework. These patterns they seem to like demand of us that we not use the things that we know about, how to organize code, how to develop APIs that are pleasant to use. Why should everyone on the team have to know what the model, what the database schema looks like? Why can't I write a view function without knowing those details because there's already an abstraction layer that separates me from that? The cool thing about once you really start digging in and building these layers is that you can test them independently. And this is sort of going back to why I care about this stuff, because when I can test what it means to release a new album independently of the view, that lets me write better tests, more self-contained tests, tests that run faster. In short, tests that do all the good things that I want tests to do. Compared to the hardest thing I've ever tested is a Django view function. You know, I start using the Django test client, and it's like, if when I got started, I was testing form validation logic doing that. It's the most like wildly uncomfortable, verbose thing ever, right? One HTTP request per like error you want to trigger in the form. it takes forever to write all those. There's so much typing, and it's like, you know at the end of it, as soon as you change like how the user interacts with it, because now they're submitting the form over like Ajax instead of a full post submission, like all the tests get invalidated for reasons that have nothing to do with your the validation logic changing. You're still checking that the start date has to be before the end date the same way, but suddenly the tests don't work. And that's a real experience I had, and it's like, I want to be able to test these things independently. I want to develop them independently. I want to be able to have people on my team who work on them independently without mixing all this logic up. That's my pitch. I hope I've convinced you to start thinking about developing your own domain-specific abstractions and really think about what's your domain, what are the actions, what are the objects of it, and if hopefully the hypothesis is that it looks a lot like what a REST API for your project would be. I don't know if that's true in practice, but there's a certain appeal to thinking about it this way. You would never give your customers the API. It's like, hey, submit some query strings, like, you get the models back, it'll be fine. Like, what do you mean that's not how you want to interact with my project? That's a terrible developer experience. Care about the developer experience of the people who work on your project as much as your customers. Questions?